Again, why would Grissom plaster the entire capsule interior with Velcro if he were concerned about the fire hazard? I can't help but sense either NASA or North American, or both, playing the little old game of blame the dead guy so you can save yourself.
It was the other three, not me. I had no idea what was going on. It really was the other three.
Now, normally Velcro is not much of a fire risk. This is Velcro in air at sea level. Under intense, direct heat, it will burn, it will melt, it will not support combustion. Now, this is Velcro in an atmosphere of 100% oxygen.
Other flammable materials included nylon and also foam rubber cushions, which were found welded to White's spacesuit. According to the authors of Mission to the Moon, it was the first time that these were put inside the cockpit. Not only were these items flammable, they were also toxic and can release poisons such as cyanide and carbon monoxide into the air. It was later established during the autopsies that the fire had breached their suits and the astronauts had died from poisonous smoke inhalation. But according to the New York Times,
the astronauts were almost completely destroyed by the fire. Little more than their bones remained.
This is exactly what happens when a dead body is cremated.
Well, what you end up with is, you've got to understand, you end up with just bones, and then the ashes, the bones are taken out of the retort and put into an ash processing machine, which crushes them and reduces them to the ash, as we call it. The equipment is designed to totally consume the coffin. There's no coffin ash. It works. The way the equipment works. It burns it over and brings it back into the chamber. The gases back into the chamber again and burns them again until the coffin is consumed totally. So, except for nails, they don't melt at all.
The actual ash. The actual ash that you get in the urns is just the skeleton. Because all the wood and all the handles and everything like that on the coffins, they just disintegrate because of the heat.
Ralph Renee often referred to this disaster as the Apollo 1 cremation. My point is, if the astronauts' flesh had been consumed by the fire, how could doctors possibly have determined that they died of smoke inhalation? Renee shared the same doubts that it was the poisons that killed them. As he told me in a personal email, an oxygen fire burns out your lungs the instant you exhale or speak. The man who flew with Gus Grissom on his return to space was astronaut John Young. When interviewed for Ron Evans' documentary, In the Shadow of the Moon, Young said this about the Apollo 1 spacecraft.
And the wires were really bad in there. I'd ask Gus. I said, Gus, why don't you say something about this wiring? I said, it's really terrible. I ought to do something about this wiring. It's really bad. And he said, I don't. And he said, I can't say anything about it or they'll fire me. That's what he told me. Couldn't believe it.
What a coincidence that shortly after bringing his findings to attention, that Thomas Ronald Barron, a North American aviation employee, was fired. It seems in Grissom's case, they fired him quite literally. Grissom had his own way of making sure the world knew how he felt about the capsule. According to NASA's website,
on January 22, 1967, Grissom made a brief stop at home before returning to the Cape. A citrus tree grew in their backyard with lemons on it as big as grapefruits. Gus yanked the largest lemon he could find off the tree. Betty had no idea what he was up to and asked what he planned to do with the lemon. "I'm going to hang it on that spacecraft," Gus said grimly, and kissed her goodbye. Betty knew that Gus would be unable to return home before the crew conducted the plugs out test on January 27th, 1967. What she did not know was that January 22nd would be the last time he was here at the house.
It's important to note that this confirmation that Grissom did indeed hang a lemon on the spacecraft came straight from NASA's website. It seems many historians and insiders alike have verified this. According to Peter Bond,
On one occasion, Grissom hung a lemon on the craft to demonstrate their discontent.
and in Frank Borman's book,
One day he picked a large lemon from a tree and hung it on the spacecraft. The gesture came uncomfortably close to being a premonition.
and finally in a book called Starfall, written by Betty Grissom, Gus's widow.
The last time Gus was home, he took a Texas lemon off our tree, and he was supposed to have hung it on the spacecraft. I guess that's when he decided that, things must be pretty bad.
In spite of this documentation that Grissom took a lemon to spacecraft 012, on his website, Jay Windley denies that Grissom hung a lemon on the spacecraft and instead hung it on the simulator. It seems Windley is not the only one who denies that the lemon was hung on the spacecraft. As we discussed previously, when Bill Casing took astronaut Jim Lovell to court on libel, Lovell denied that Grissom hung a lemon on the Apollo capsule. His exact quote,
Grissom was critical of the quality control of the Block 1 command module. He did not hang a large lemon on the capsule the day he died.
This is not what Jim Lovell told us on page 13 of his book, Lost Moon, written just 3 years earlier.
The Apollo spacecraft, by even the most charitable estimations, was turning out to be an Edsel. Actually, among the astronauts, it was thought of as worse than an Edsel. An Edsel is a clunker, but an essentially harmless clunker. Apollo was downright disastrous. Earlier in development and testing of the spacecraft, the nozzle of the ship's giant engine, the one that would have to function perfectly, place the moonship in lunar orbit and blast it on its own way home again, shattered like a teacup when engineers tried to fire it. During splashdown tests, the heat shield of the craft had split open, causing the command module to sink like a $35 million anvil to the bottom of a factory test pool. The environmental control had already logged 200 individual failures. The spacecraft as a whole had already logged roughly 20,000. During one checkout run at the manufacturing plant, a disgusted Gus Grissom walked away from the command module after leaving a lemon perched atop it.
On a side note, the 20,000 command module failures, 200 of which being in the environmental control system alone, was previously brought up by Ralph Renee. His source of this information were the authors of Journey to Tranquility. They write, "At least 20,000 failures of all kinds had been logged," Joe Shea said, "more than 200 of them in the environmental control system." Robert Brannig rightly states that this argument comes from Ralph Renee, yet he claims he is unfamiliar with the source material.
This is the claim of hoax advocate Ralph Renee. Although I am unfamiliar with the source of this information, Mr. Renee's assertion is clear. The early missions had so many insurmountable problems that NASA decided to abandon the moon landings and fake it. Even if the data is accurate, there is a big difference between a defect and a major technical problem.
Jay Windley has previously claimed to have read Renee's book, yet not only does he neglect to specify how critical these problems were, he also alleges that Renee himself doesn't know.
Is that a lot? Were they crucial systems? Mr. Renee either doesn't know or doesn't wish to disclose it. This is where Mr. Renee might have benefited from some actual engineering experience.
Ironically, in the same article, Windley goes on to state that a single defect could have blown the whole thing.
Only if it were a defect in a critical system for which there was no redundancy, the lunar module ascent engine for example, implying that no defects of any kind were permitted during a successful flight is very naive.
What Windley fails to reveal in his website is that the lunar module ascent engine was indeed defect-plagued. As we are told in Renee's same source material, in short, the two main engines of the lunar module had to be infallible. Yet in January 1968, the ascent engine in particular was proving to be only too prone to error.